We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition.
What a long, strange trip it's been. Earlier this year, the government received the Glaze report and immediately announced that it would be enacting all of its recommendations. The Premier, without personally consulting with education professionals, went full steam ahead on the changes. Now, on the eve of our return to the legislature, the Premier finally sits down with teachers and comes away with a new plan. My question, through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is, why does he continue to incite chaos with the education system when the prudent path was to meet with the teachers before announcing his changes?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for her new role, and if I had my way, I'd make it permanent. Because as I look across there, Madam Leader, you're the one that should be leading that party. But to her question, Mr. Speaker, I will say this to her. The Education Minister has been traveling across this province as the Glaze report came out, meeting with SACs, meeting with teachers, meeting with administrators. He's met with the Principals Forum, Mr. Speaker. A few days ago, the President of the Union asked to have a meeting with me. I met her yesterday. It was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to introducing legislation, Mr. Speaker, that will continue to transform the education system that will be focused on students.
The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition.
Parents and students started this week with an understanding of the future this government was forcing upon them. They may not have liked it, they may not have agreed with it, but at least they could begin to prepare for it. This morning they woke up to no plan and no direction. The content of the meeting with the teachers is being kept from the public, so no one knows what is to come next. Can the Premier tell us today which of the 22 recommendations from the Glaze report are now under reconsideration and which recommendations Nova Scotians can expect to move ahead with?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank the Honourable Member for the question. As I said to her, I met with the President of Nova Scotia Teachers Union, as all members of this House, most Nova Scotians will know. I'm a reasonable person, Mr. Speaker. She laid out a few suggestions. I said I would look at them, but I want to tell the Honourable Member there will be legislation coming to this House that will continue to transform the education system that is focused on students.
The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again, more questions than answers. I think all Nova Scotians today are watching very closely, watching with great anticipation as the Premier and the teachers carry out their meetings. Meanwhile, parents are still in the all too familiar limbo of not knowing if their children will be going to school tomorrow, Thursday, Friday. I don't need to tell you, Mr. Speaker, the stress and worry a short notice strike creates. So can the Premier tell Nova Scotia parents if he was able to secure an agreement from the teachers on a strike action before engaging in protracted discussions?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I believe, as I've always believed, Mr. Speaker, that educators across this province will not become involved in an illegal strike, Mr. Speaker, but that is their decision. I would encourage all parents, Mr. Speaker, members of the opposition, to continue to plead to the Teachers Union and teachers, Mr. Speaker, not to go into an illegal strike activity.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, the Premier eliminated the district health authorities on a promise of improved efficiencies and care. And what we got instead was a $2 billion organization that meets behind closed doors. Now we're being presented with the same pitch relative to the elimination of local voices in all of our school boards. So I want to ask the Premier, why should the public believe that the hyper-centralist approach that's been so disastrous in health care is going now to be anything other than disastrous in education?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker. if the member would actually read the Glaze report, Mr. Speaker, this is focused on site-based activity. Mr. Speaker, administrators in schools have been looking for more independence, Mr. Speaker. This is a positive sign. Give them a chance, Mr. Speaker, to be the educational leaders they are in their particular schools, Mr. Speaker. Their direct reporting line directly to the minister. This is a positive sign. Increase in the SACs. Give communities a stronger voice in those school communities, Mr. Speaker. We're looking forward to continuing to empower communities and school communities to continue to be all they can be.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, at the February 21st meeting of the Halifax Regional School Board, Archie Beals, HRSB African Nova Scotia representative, spoke of the proposed abolition of school boards, and he said this: "We were the last one at the table, and now they're taking away the table." So I ask the Premier, is he actually going to take away the school board system that guaranteed African Nova Scotia representation in our province?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, African Nova Scotians will continue to have guaranteed representation, Mr. Speaker, on the board across this province. They'll continue to have a voice in school communities across this province, Mr. Speaker. I want to ensure that honourable member and all members of this House that minority rights will be protected under this government. Will continue to make sure that they have a strong government that represents them, Mr. Speaker, not only in the education system but in the justice system and every other system that this government is part of.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
The question was about the guaranteed African Nova Scotia seats on the school boards, Mr. Speaker. And further to that point, dismay has also been expressed across the province that in abolishing school boards, the government is going to be eliminating the one level of democracy where in our province we have a majority of women. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier really want to be the man who ended the one level of electoral democracy we have in our province where women are adequately represented?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker. The Premier that has the most women ever elected under Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the Honourable Member I appointed more women to the Executive Council than any other Premier in the history of this province. I want to remind the Honourable Member when he had an opportunity to appoint women to the bench, their government ignored it. I want to tell them we just announced gender parity, Mr. Speaker. When you look at our appointments, they were predominantly female, Mr. Speaker. And I challenge the Honourable Member to look at the Deputy Ministers across this province. Female representation is above 50%. I will put my record on the line against anyone in this House when it comes to ensuring that our daughters and mothers are represented here.
The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Fisheries. According to the Minister of Fisheries, his mandate letter states that he is responsible for advocating on behalf of Nova Scotia fishers. Last week, the minister held a conference that promoted the sustainability of our fishing industry, which I totally believe should be celebrated. When local fishers approached the minister to express their concerns about Northern Pulp's effluent treatment plan and its potential effects on their fishing zones, he said he was listening, but not his problem. It's a federal problem. Will the minister do his job and commit to speaking with his colleagues at the Department of Environment to ensure all fishing groups affected are properly consulted during the environmental assessment process?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much. I was very pleased to meet with some of the people that came from Pictou and other areas to talk about the issues they had around the Northern Pulp. And indeed, it's the responsibility of the Department of Federal Environment and also the Department of DFO in the oceans off Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's unfortunate that the minister wouldn't let them into the meeting. He had to go outside to meet them. It's also unfortunate that they wouldn't put the subject on their agenda. Anyway, the lobster industry, as we all know, is a $3 billion industry in Canada, and over $900 million of the Nova Scotia economy is lobster industry related. There is too much at stake here, Minister, to idly sit by and say it's a federal issue. Again, fishers are counting on the minister to do more than just listen and say that it's a federal issue. I expect the minister to relay the concerns of fishers to the federal minister to ensure that every fisher who wants to be heard will be heard. Will the minister commit to Nova Scotia fishers that he will be their advocate on this most important issue?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
I stress again to the member opposite, which I did to the group that visited the event on Friday, that indeed it's the responsibility of DFO and it's the responsibility of the federal environment when it comes to the ocean.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in her report, Dr. Glaze speaks of the depth of, this is her word, mistrust between teachers and the government that she encountered in the course of her consultations. So I want to ask the Premier, will he acknowledge that by ploughing ahead this sitting with the implementation of the Glaze recommendations, he stands to take the already deeply troubled relationship between the government and teachers in Nova Scotia and make it that much worse?
The Honourable Premier.
No.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Go ahead. Go up. He just said no.
Oh, sorry.
Just let it sink in. Let it sink in.
Hey, the previous answer, Mr. Speaker, had me softened up. Mr. Speaker, in her report, Dr. Glaze also writes these three short sentences. Relationships matter, trust matters, mutual respect matters. Now, while we in the NDP have a number of differences with Dr. Glaze, on these three sentences, we agree completely. And so in the name of this value she speaks about, of mutual respect and of trust, I ask the Premier, will he agree to not proceed further this setting with the Glaze proposals until they have been given a thorough reappraisal and reconsideration?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As I said, I had an opportunity to meet with the President of the Teachers Union yesterday, Mr. Speaker. We had a great conversation. We went through all the recommendations, Mr. Speaker. I told her that I would get back to her on a few points, but I reassured her, and I want to reassure all members of this House, there will be legislation in this session to continue to transform the education system in our province.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. If there is one thing that is abundantly clear with respect to the Glaze report, it is that the relationship between this government and our teachers is broken. I cannot imagine, Mr. Speaker, a path for meaningful education reform that does not include an open and constructive collegial dialogue between the officials who create education policy and the teachers who are in our classrooms. The threat of job action by our teachers only serves to underscore the depth of the schism in our education system. Why has the minister allowed the relationship between the government and the teachers get to a point where there is a threat of children losing time in their classrooms? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said on the record, any illegal job action I do not believe is in the best interests of our students or our communities. I acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do in terms of rebuilding relationships with our teachers. We have gotten out, myself and department staff, these last couple weeks to meet with classroom teachers, principals, community members directly. And what's become very clear is that we have a lot of mutual understanding to achieve together. And I think we can do that, but we can do that even during moments of disagreement. That's also key, because in order for this to function properly, it needs to be a two-way street. And the way these conversations play out right now online make it very difficult to have that constructive relationship. Mr. Speaker, I know we can do better, but all of us can do better in terms of fostering a more positive, productive relationship in the education system.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, the way the minister describes the situation, it's as if it's all hugs and high fives between the government and the teachers. The reality is the opposite. 82% of teachers in this province took a dramatic step to authorize a strike. 82% of teachers believe that facing fines and sanctions were preferable to allowing the Glaze report recommendations to go ahead unopposed. I cannot overstate how much classroom uncertainty has been created by the rift that dominates the discussions around education reform. Again, I ask the Minister, what will he do to begin to mend the situation and create an atmosphere of trust between the government and the teachers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, it starts by understanding that we can work through challenges even during moments of disagreement. That has been a challenge that we've experienced as a government. Every time there's a disagreement either with the union or segments of the profession, the conversation quickly has gotten very personal and difficult to engage in a productive manner. I think that's something that we can all recognize. We are having conversations with union leadership, which have been helpful and productive. I've had personal conversations with the front lines. I have a better understanding of the complexity of reasons why individuals voted for illegal strike action, which isn't even just related to the Glaze report, if we're being frank with one another. But, Mr. Speaker, I still recognize we have a lot more work to do, and we're committed to doing that.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. Recently, the Nova Scotia Health Authority hired a provincial senior director in charge of mental health and addictions. This is an important position, as well established to most of us, that the mental health system in Nova Scotia is broken. Too many people wait too long for services, too many people fall through the cracks, and we know that the wait times in Cape Breton are the longest in the province, 363 days for adults and 157 days for children and adolescents. Despite these terrible statistics, the new Senior Director of Mental Health and Addiction Services came from the worst performing mental health team in the province, just as the outgoing Senior Director had been. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, if we want to fix the system and do a better job in mental health, why are the senior managers being hired from the team that has the people waiting the longest?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Of course, I believe all members in this legislature share concern over access to mental health services and certainly share government's priority and focus on providing those services to Nova Scotians and improving our mental health services and access to mental health services across the province. With respect to the hiring process, Mr. Speaker, of that particular position that was referenced, that goes through a hiring process, Mr. Speaker, and any candidate that has any concern as to their availability or consideration through that process, they're certainly welcome to follow up with the health authorities in that hiring process.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, mental health advocates are losing faith in this system and in this government. They fear that factors other than ability to improve patient care take priority in the health authorities' hiring practices. One group is called #HowManyNovaScotians is calling on the Minister of Health to launch a formal and independent inquiry into the hiring of staff of the Mental Health and Addictions Program of the NSHA. The Minister should want to know why these kind of hires are happening in his system that he is responsible for. Will the Minister increase transparency and accountability in the Health Authority by looking at these hirings himself?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess just looking for some clarification from the member opposite, Mr. Speaker. I believe the concerns raised by the member opposite with the individual that was hired seem to stem on performance and access in a particular system, Mr. Speaker. I didn't hear any issues or concerns specifically with the qualifications or the expertise of the individual who received the appointment, Mr. Speaker. So if the member actually has specific concerns or challenges with the quality and the qualifications of the individual, Mr. Speaker, rather than where they come from, Mr. Speaker, if that's how the member opposite wishes that we choose where people are hired, then Mr. Speaker, you can certainly bring that forward. There are processes in place to consider the hiring. If there are concerns...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
As I'd indicated in my first response, Mr. Speaker, there are processes in place for anyone who has concerns with the hiring process in a specific case, and if there's concerns with a specific candidate who received that appointment, Mr. Speaker, he can bring them forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also to the Minister of Health. On February the 12th, the lives of Cape Bretoners were put in jeopardy when no ambulances were available for the whole island. Imagine from the north side to the causeway, down both sides of the island, not a single ambulance was available. An ambulance from Antigonish had to be reassigned to Cape Breton, an ambulance that I'm sure that region was loath to spare. It was a desperate move that left both Cape Breton and Antigonish undersourced. Is the minister satisfied that there was adequate ambulance coverage in Cape Breton with only one ambulance available for the whole island?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with respect to ambulance service and the way that the system operates, Mr. Speaker, throughout the province, it's designed to be a dynamic system, Mr. Speaker, not to have those ambulances that are available, Mr. Speaker, to respond. In addition to the ambulance, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we also have our helicopters, Mr. Speaker, which we had the opportunity in the fall to welcome into service. 2 helicopters now, Mr. Speaker, as well as a fixed-wing aircraft, providing supports and emergency services to Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the reason those ambulances are tied up because they're waiting in line at the regional hospital because there's no beds available, Mr. Speaker, and other emergency departments are closed that they can't go to. The minister continues to deny there's a crisis in health care, but under his watch, the dangerous practice of rationing ambulances has taken place. All of us have been taught in an emergency to pick up the phone, dial 911, and emergency services will come to help. We all go about our day under the belief that when help is needed, help is only a phone call away, a belief that Cape Bretoners can no longer enjoy, Mr. Speaker. This Liberal mismanagement is unfair to both the citizens and the paramedics. So my question to the minister is, how can Cape Bretoners be sure there will be an ambulance for them when they need it, when this minister is satisfied that one is enough?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure the member and all members, Mr. Speaker, as well as constituents, that the services being provided by the EHS system for the province and the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, that they are reviewed and assessed based upon their performance, and they have standard service levels that they have to meet in responding to emergency situations, Mr. Speaker. We continue to monitor and assess those performance metrics, Mr. Speaker, and we respond accordingly when there are needs for enhanced services throughout the province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Education. Often in response to my questions in this House, the Minister has claimed that he makes his decisions based on evidence. I have concerns that the administrative review, which he is using to justify sweeping changes to our schools and classrooms, is incorrect in sounding an alarm about Nova Scotian students' performance. As many people have now pointed out, our children achieve at or above the expected levels on both the Pan-Canadian Assessment Program, PCAP, and the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA. Mr. Speaker, how can the minister have confidence in his decisions when the evidence they are based on is faulty?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's 2 challenges that we're trying to overcome here. One, provincially, our students have only achieved at the national average or below consistently for a long time. Regionally, the achievement levels vary from region to region depending on what board you're working under. These are 2 challenges, in my opinion, that are important to overcome. They are system-based challenges. The structure of the education system has created challenges to do better. And since when, Mr. Speaker, has this House accepted middle of the road as best for our kids? When will we let our eyes look a little higher to a better horizon when our kids are competing with the very best in this country and beyond?
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
With respect, Mr. Speaker, no one is arguing for the status quo. We're simply stating that average performance, as with the member next to me's comment about ambulances, does not equal a crisis in the opinion of this government, so far as we've seen. Parents, students, teachers, and school boards have been asking for a willing partner to make the changes needed for a long time, and instead this government has locked students out, chosen to legislate rather than collaborate, and is now responsible for the 2nd strike vote ever by teachers in as many years. Parents and teachers are experts who want what is best for our children. Mr. Speaker, if the minister has confidence in his reforms, then why does he feel the need to bulldoze forward in this sitting? And why is he so afraid to listen to the public?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I've gone out and met with the public. extensively over the course of the last number of weeks. And let's not pretend that this is the first report that has told us there needs to be a change in the administrative model of our education system, Mr. Speaker. This just happened with the Myra Freeman report, who engaged thousands of Nova Scotians over the course of a year, Mr. Speaker. And so how many reports giving us recommendations to transform our education system have to sit on a shelf and collect dust before we actually do something in this province, Mr. Speaker? The time is now. The time is now, Mr. Speaker, and in fact, I want to remind the member opposite is in fact the leader of the third party who actually told our government that our education system is in crisis. And I will table that quote for the pleasure of the House, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question is not for the Minister of Health, but for the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, this week, residents of Manitou had enough and started talking to local media about the state of their local road. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. The residents describe the highway as a washboard of ruts, potholes, and paved shoulder that is falling apart. Ken Wadden was pictured in the Cape Breton Post just yesterday, showing Sharon Montgomery the state of the highway. Mr. Speaker, this coastal drive is a very important piece of the Cape Breton tourism industry and, more importantly, important for the local residents. So my question to the Minister is, when will the people of Manitou see their highway get the proper repairs so residents and tourists alike can travel this important link without fearing of damage to their vehicles?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question, and I have to agree with him about the beauty, the inherent loveliness of Manitou. It's just a wonderful part of Nova Scotia, and I would encourage everybody in the House at least to make a visit there, because he's absolutely right. And in terms of the road,
please. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Like all many rural roads in Nova Scotia, our department has a huge commitment to improving the condition. And let it be said that we have that road in our sights, and once we get through this spring period, we'll be looking at it very closely. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that he would like to have a lot of people come to Manitou, and I can guarantee him he's in our sights as well. Mr. Speaker, they suggest that the road hasn't seen any maintenance in over 20 years, and the fact that school buses travel the road every day and they bounce the children all over their seats, then that concerns me, Mr. Speaker. And of course, we have the situation of the Myra Bridge being removed last November, and still no plan for that. The people of the area feel that they have been forgotten, Mr. Speaker. So I would ask that the Minister commit today to, when the House is finished, to coming to Manitou and drive that road with me to see the shape that it is in, and be able to give a map to the rest of his colleagues on how to find Manitou.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank the member opposite for the question, and we'll certainly undertake to take a look at the Manitou Road, in particular with regard to the Myra Bridge. We're not inactive. We're working with our federal partners. We're looking at a plan. We're looking at a plan there in terms of the access that bridge represents into the area there, and we're moving to analyze that situation and make a good determination of what we're going to do for the residents of that area. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, this government is obsessed with amalgamation. First it was the health authority, then it was the school boards, and now they're pushing the concept of municipal modernization. The department participated in a January 31st presentation on amalgamation that included an offensive cartoon that depicts Pictou County as backwards and, quote, the problem. The presenters saw the error that they made and changed the cartoon for subsequent versions of the presentation, but their opinion was made quite clear, Mr. Speaker. My question today is, will the Minister of Municipal Affairs apologize for his department's involvement in this presentation and its thinly veiled insult to the municipal leaders and residents of Pictou County?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. The picture that he's describing is a picture that was in the Chronicle Herald back from 2016. The rationale for it being used in the presentation at the time was to tell the story about the challenges that municipal government face and that amalgamation isn't always the answer. Municipal modernization for us is about moving forward and encouraging municipalities to break down those traditional barriers and talk to one another, to plan with one another, to organize with one another. I've made it quite clear at the UNSM conference that we will not force amalgamation. But what I told those municipalities is that think beyond those traditional boundaries and start talking to your neighbours.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear an apology in there. What I heard was some rationalization why an offensive cartoon was used. I've asked the minister again, hopefully he will apologize this time, but beyond the choice of the poor illustration, the heart of the problem is amalgamation itself. And in a 2016 plebiscite, the people of Pictou County made their feelings very clear, Mr. Speaker. 2/3 of the voters rejected a proposal for municipal amalgamation in the county. Any change to our governance structure should start with the people. What do the people want? Shouldn't finish there, Mr. Speaker. And I heard the minister say that he won't force amalgamation, but I'd ask him two things in this part. Maybe he'll apologize this time for the use of the cartoon and just reiterate that he will not dictate terms or force amalgamation on Pictou County or, in fact, any jurisdiction in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. And in response to the member, correspondence has actually already been sent by my department, the UNSM, Unity Nova Scotia Municipalities, and the municipal administrators to the mayors of those towns and the CAOs, outlining that they too understood their concerns that came forward in regards to that cartoon. Again, that cartoon was a cartoon in the Chronicle Herald back in 2016 that depicted the challenges that municipalities face and that amalgamation isn't always the answer. We are not forcing amalgamation on any community in this province. I was quite clear about that at the UNSM conference. I toured this province. I met with every municipality. I met with every village, and I told them that to be successful, we have to think together, we have to organize together, we have to plan together, and we have to think about moving away from those traditional boundaries so that we can all be successful as municipalities in Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture. On January 5th, Cook Aquaculture sustained damage at their Jordan Bay operations site. There have been conflicting reports to the extent of the damage sustained at the site. Cook Aquaculture, along with the Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture, says that there was minimal damage, that fish mortality was limited, and that no fish had escaped. Locals, on the other hand, paint a far different picture and show debris laying on the coastline. They are concerned that based on the condition of the cages, fish did indeed escape. They refer to it as the salmon slaughter. My question is, it has now been over a month. To set the record straight, will the minister commit to releasing the latest reports completed by his staff on the damage and cleanup at Cook Aquaculture?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much. It's a very good question. I thank the member for bringing it forward. Indeed, we did review the site on several occasions. We actually sent our helicopters to the Department of Natural Resources up twice. There was accusations of fish floating all over the place and on the beaches and everything. We photographed it. There was absolutely none, zero. And indeed, we checked with the company and we verified that there was no fish escaped.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, aquaculture is a vitally important industry to Nova Scotia. It accounts for $60 million and hundreds of jobs for our rural communities. Consumers expect that the products they're consuming are safe and raised in humane conditions. The site at Jordan Bay has now experienced 3 incidents that have led to threatening the reputation of Nova Scotia aquaculture industry and resulted in extremely negative headlines for the province. My question is, can the minister clearly explain the steps taken by his department to ensure there is no salmon slaughter part 2?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much. I can assure you that was the case. Typically in a storm that some of the fish would die. That's a normal occurrence on any site. But I will ask the member also to look on the beaches around that area and see the number of lobster traps that are washed up on the shore. It was a very severe storm, and according to Nova Scotia Power, some of the winds were higher than Hurricane Juan.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in the last 5 years, the number of patients visiting emergency rooms who don't have a family doctor has doubled. Mr. Speaker, we know the numbers at the Halifax Infirmary, but what about our other hospitals? Surely, if there are this many people in Halifax ERs, they must be showing up elsewhere as well. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, can he tell this House how many patients across Nova Scotia are winding up in emergency rooms because they do not have a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. It's no secret, Mr. Speaker, that there are many Nova Scotians looking for access to primary care services in their communities. That's why we commit to a number of initiatives, Mr. Speaker, to help encourage the recruitment and retention of family physicians, Mr. Speaker, but also other healthcare professionals to join the teams with the family physicians to provide primary care access, to improve that access within our communities, Mr. Speaker. It's important to know that the emergency services that are available within the province, Mr. Speaker, provide care when needed. But major priority, Mr. Speaker, around primary care is, of course, strengthening the teams we have and expanding our teams across the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we know that Halifax isn't the only place where Nova Scotians have no choice but to turn to emergency rooms for primary care. We should not have a situation where people who need to see a regular family doctor wind up in hospital beds. But we do have that situation, Mr. Speaker, and because of this, we have terrible things happening. We have grown children watching elderly parents take their last breaths in crowded hospital corridors. Mr. Speaker, I've asked this and I'll ask again. Does the Minister of Health share our outrage at the state of healthcare in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've never shied away from recognizing that there are challenges in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. What we've recognized is the need to do more. That's why we continue to invest in expanding our primary care services, Mr. Speaker. We're working with, just last week, Mr. Speaker, a new program to help encourage the recruitment of international physicians to Nova Scotia. It's something that was done in partnership with my colleague, the Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, we expand the tuition relief program, Mr. Speaker, and other incentives to...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Tuition relief, Mr. Speaker, and other incentives, make them available to physicians across the province, Mr. Speaker, not limited to just some communities. And, Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, we plan to expanding our residency...
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Our residency programs and collaborative care practice, Mr. Speaker, all in an effort to improve primary care access to communities across the province for all Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. He indicated that let's stop being middle of the road. I propose we start focusing where the rubber meets the road, and let's focus on the classrooms. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is directed about the conditions in our classrooms. Since the school year has begun, there have been many reports, and my office has received multiple calls about the shortage of French teachers in our schools. In January, my colleague, the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, received more calls about the same issue. The minister displayed leadership to the francophone community when the Conseil scolaire was left out of the closures recommended in the Glaze report. But the continued shortage of qualified French teachers in our French immersion schools is a direct contrast to that leadership. My question is this: when will steps be taken to ensure French immersion students have qualified and consistent French teachers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, the recruitment and retention of French-speaking teachers is a challenge in this province, but it's also a national challenge. And that is being experienced right now in every jurisdiction outside of Quebec in this country. And it is something that we do need to address. We're working with our BED program to ensure that we are doing our job recruiting those qualified teachers and making sure they have a clear path into the workforce in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
And Mr. Speaker, of course, I encourage this government to continue doing that. French immersion students, especially in junior high, who do not receive adequate and consistent French language instruction, we know are at a significant disadvantage when they reach high school. They are often forced to leave the immersion program or they require additional instruction because they lack the basics needed for success. Bilingualism is an important skill for any Canadian or Nova Scotian to have. When will the government act to ensure our students have the opportunity to learn in French? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That work is ongoing and will continue to be ongoing. This isn't a new challenge that this province has faced. Multiple governments have faced this shortage of French-speaking teachers. Other jurisdictions are experiencing it as well. There is a critical mass issue in terms of how many people are entering into the workforce with that particular skill set. So we do need to keep working together in the Atlantic provinces to develop strategies, and we'll continue to work with our BED programs and our CSAP to ensure that we're doing our very best to meet the needs of our school communities.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. On Thursday, February 15th, the Minister visited the former DSME Trenton facility. Pictou County is still hoping that a buyer will surface and operate a business on this 160-acre site. The facility requires approximately $150,000 per month to maintain its operation. Question to the Minister, will there be additional funds in the upcoming budget to continue the pursuit of a prospective buyer for this large facility?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. This government shares the concerns and the wishes of the people of Pictou County. It's always been our intention to find a buyer, find an operator for that facility. Having the chance to see it and understand the magnitude of this place and the equipment that was invested with the money they received from the previous government, it really is a valuable asset for the right taker. But at 430,000 square feet, there would have to be the right size buyer. We've been looking at this for a very long time. The point of really the point of the visit for myself and for the staff was to get another opportunity to spread the message publicly that we are looking for a suitor and that we want to have serious conversations. So we're getting to that point, as the member said, at $150,000 per month for a few years now. We're going to have to make a decision very soon. So we're hoping to get something solidified before the end of the fiscal year. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the Minister would agree that the facility still maintains promise and could be a viable operation once again. Pictou County, Nova Scotia would welcome the jobs and spin-offs its continued operation will create. However, I acknowledge that the Minister may not have any alternative going forward but to liquidate the assets. I question the Minister, in the event of a liquidation, could the Minister provide some detail on the plan to remediate the site and whether he would consider turning the land over to the town of Trenton?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to that question, so really there's three options. The best one for our government and for the people of Pictou County and all Nova Scotians is that we find a buyer in totality that would take the entire precinct and use it for private sector operations. The one that certainly is least favourable, that we've been trying to avoid and will continue to avoid to the extent possible, is that liquidation of assets, just to recover the remaining costs that are there associated with the remediation. But the middle one is to look at the different aspects of the precinct. Some buildings are very old, some are new and have had recent retrofits, and again with the overhead cranes and the significant valued assets that have been invested there, we could look at sort of a mix of remediating some parts of that precinct while selling others and opening up private sector opportunities. So all options are on the table. We just want to do the right thing and avoid any liquidation at all costs. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, another question for the Minister responsible for Tourism Nova Scotia. At last fall's tourism conference, the Minister for Tourism Nova Scotia referred to our provincial visitor information centres as baby seals. Clearly, he'd like to get rid of them, but he feels they're untouchable. Mr. Speaker, these centres provide valuable information to visitors and promotional opportunities for many small businesses. Who in the tourism audience wants him to close these centres, and why?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, with the tourism centres, the VICs that we have, what I was referring to is the fact that when there was talk about whether or not they were serving the purpose based on the new formats of sharing information and collecting information for travellers, which the data is very clear, they're not utilized as much as they used to be. Having said that, though, community stakeholders from tourism operators to the local workforce to, of course, citizens in general, want to maintain their importance because they think they are valuable. So for us, when the people speak to us in that sense, we listen. So we want to understand what the value is. If there's a transition that we can do in terms of a different model, different offering inside these VICs, then that's what we're looking for. If you look at all these sites across the province, Mr. Speaker, they really do have a different application, from the one at the Causeway, the one in Amherst, the one in Yarmouth. If you look at the different purposes, there is a varied usage for them. So we just want to make the best of those, and we're not giving up on those until we find the right model for Tourism Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do take some comfort in the minister's words, because it does sound like he has heard from the industry and from the people who are creating the industry, Mr. Speaker, all the business owners out there in the province. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the government in Port Hastings, in my constituency, over 75,000 people have stopped at the visitor centre. Mr. Speaker, that is proof that these are the customers and they want the service. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister confirm that he will keep our provincial visitor information centres open, because they are indeed helping to grow our tourism industry, which, as I understand, we are all trying to grow it and to double it?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every decision we make around tourism is to hit that $4 billion goal. We're at about $2.7 billion, which is pretty incredible, and we're not inside that window. Thank you. So look, when it comes to VICs, again, Tourism Nova Scotia has more of a marketing and promotional mandate with not so much with operations as it used to be, but the VICs are important. They are important to the communities in which they serve and to that regional grid, as the member has identified. So for us, we are committed to finding a solution. I really believe that there's a hybrid model of private sector operation there with information services, but also including some of the things that Taste of Nova Scotia would do, for example. That could be sort of a place for demonstration for all that we have in terms of our tourism complement. So I do see a future. It may not look like it did in the past, but we know VICs are important to the communities in which they serve. And we'll make sure that we take our time, do it right, and figure out the best model for each and every one of the VIC sites.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, every 6 days a woman in Canada is killed by her intimate partner. We know that many individuals stay in dangerous situations, not because they don't want to leave, but because they are financially entangled with their abuser. We also know that of those people who have reported incidents of domestic violence, more than 50% have experienced an abusive incident at or near the workplace. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Labour. Does he agree that gendered violence is a workplace issue?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, any violence against women in this province is not only a workplace issue, but it's a society issue. And it is one that this government takes very seriously, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're also looking at legislation to help females that are in a work situation to be able to access time off, to be able to deal with the situation they're in, and to be able to have that support so that they don't feel that their job is in jeopardy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister. That's a good segue into my next question. Mr. Speaker, people should not be penalised when they are at work and victimised at home or in public. In January, New Brunswick updated its Employment Standards Act by introducing paid leave provisions for people experiencing domestic or intimate partner violence. In modernising the Act, they joined Manitoba, Ontario, Alberta and Saskatchewan as a province where survivors of gender-based violence are eligible for practical support, not just rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of Labour commit to implementing paid leave for survivors of gender-based violence in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add some clarification there. New Brunswick actually did not put paid leave. They did it through regulation. That is not a commitment that government has made. But, Mr. Speaker, what I will say is that I will bring in a minimum standard. And when we did go out and do consultation with organizations in this province, what we found is most organizations were already exceeding a minimum standard that we would put in. My hope is that every company in this province would actually give individuals the support that they need. But what we will do in light of that, Mr. Speaker, is we will put the minimum standards in place so that anybody who's in this situation will not feel that their job is at risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in October, the Premier committed to thinking about the possibility of requiring the Nova Scotia Health Authority to make minutes of their board meetings public, and I'll table those quotes actually from the Premier. It's a great idea. After all, the Health Authority gets more than $2 billion in taxpayer funding. Taxpayers certainly should be able to see how their money is being spent, Mr. Speaker. With 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor and some of the longest wait lists in the country, we can't blame Nova Scotians for being so suspicious. So will the Premier consider having the Nova Scotia Health Authority accountable to the people who fund it? Will he make a decision to open up those minutes?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question again. Mr. Speaker, as she knows, the Minister of Health has been working with the Health Authority on a number of issues. I want to congratulate him. This is an issue that is important to many Nova Scotians, to all Nova Scotians. We will embarking with the Health Authority and looking at what is a better way that we can engage Nova Scotians or ensure that Nova Scotians have access to the appropriate information that comes out of those meetings. We would obviously, there's some issues that would come up we would have to obviously go in camera with, but we're looking at what is the possibility of ensuring that those Nova Scotians who want access to that information can have it.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.